Welcome to History Comes Alive, outside the Ayala Museum because of the pandemic. The pandemic seems to be something that is new to us, and yet if you look at our history, the past 200 years, we've had pandemics and epidemics of cholera, bubonic plague, the Spanish flu. I'd like to think that history maybe erases things that we don't want to remember, but yet history has many traces of things that go back to former times. During the pandemic, after doing other things like fixing my room and preparing the slide deck to be played during my funeral, I realized that maybe there are traces of previous pandemics in our lives. And I realized by looking just outside people's houses that we usually have a palaspas outside. This palaspas today is believed to protect you from evil spirits, from thieves, from lightning, or for anything bad. But maybe the palaspas was also used in former times to ward off disease or ward off plagues. In the Old Testament story, Moses tells people to put the blood of a lamb on their doors so that the angel of death would skip them and not take their firstborn. In the Philippines, I think that has become our palaspas, the Palm Sunday frond, which is supposed to make evil or anything bad pass over your home. I also think that when you go and explore Philippine antique shops, you will see many images, folk images, of San Roque, who is the saint that is invoked against the plague. A saint who has his skirt up, and you can see it has a wound, which was part of his disease. He was not really quarantined, but was set outside town, and a dog is supposed to have brought bread to him every day. Images of San Roque were brought around during cholera epidemics in the 19th century, and even in the early 20th century, they would bring religious images around town, hope to drive off the disease. But people started to have images in their own homes in order to protect them from disease. The late national artist for literature, Alejandro Roses, used to tell me that to ward off a dog attack, one just had to put out your hand and you shout San Roque, and the dog is supposed to stop. I have never tried this because I'm too scared to validate whether this is true or not. But that was one of the uses of San Roque's dog. We have had a teleserye called Aso ni San Roque about a cute dog. But what was the belief because of this folk image of San Roque's dog was that there is a belief that if you have a wound and you let a dog lick it, it will get miraculously cured or will cure faster. One of the most famous fatalities of rabies was Fernando Po Sr., the father of FPJ, or Fernando Po Jr. He was on set making a film, and I think he was injured, had a wound, and he had a puppy, very cute puppy, come into the set and lick his wound, not knowing that the puppy was rabid. So he died of rabies, the most prominent victim of rabies, all because people still believe that a dog can actually cure a wound. When we go out in the street and buy from a sorbetero, we usually call this type of ice cream dirty ice cream. And yet, even if Filipinos call it dirty ice cream, they still buy it and they still eat it. And nobody seems to know why we call it dirty ice cream. But I'd like to think that this goes all the way back to the early American period, when the Americans tried to introduce sanitation in the Philippines to correct food handling, food preparation. And so what we now know as dirty ice cream may have come from the early cholera epidemics. One of the earliest diseases that we know about from historical literature was smallpox. And this is quite Interesting because if you are doing a tour of Intramuros, Manila today, and you go to the Manila Cathedral, most of the time people ignore a bronze monument that stands outside the cathedral. Most people don't notice it because it's not a very pretty monument. But this monument is quite important because it was erected in Manila in the 19th century to thank Charles IV or Carlos IV for giving smallpox vaccine. There was in 1803 the Royal Vaccination Expedition led by a doctor named Balmis. And Balmis traveled all the way from Spain through Spanish America from 1803, and he arrived in Manila from Mexico in 1805, carrying 25 Mexican orphan boys that he brought along the trip, carrying the disease, and they transferred it along the trip. They would transfer it from the arm of one boy to another so that the disease would be able to travel live all the way from Mexico to the Philippines. And when they arrived, they used this as a vaccine to help people overcome smallpox. Of course, people were very, very scared. Why will I allow myself to be vaccinated with something that was actually you feared very much? But the Spanish Governor General and his own children were vaccinated first. And so everyone was able to be vaccinated in Manila and outside Manila. And from here, they brought orphan boys from Manila and brought them to Macau and Canton. The only trace we have of the Balmis expedition is presently in the Research Institute of Tropical Medicine in Alabang, where a historical marker in the Balmis building tells us about this gift of smallpox vaccine in 1805 by Charles IV. The other thing that we don't remember is bubonic plague. We usually think this was something that happened in the Middle Ages and killed millions of people. But in the Philippines, we had the bubonic plague in 1899, 1905, and as late as 1912. And we know that the bubonic plague was spread by rats and the fleas that were on rats. So in order to contain the disease, they had to control the ports, which was the entry point of this disease. And so what the Philippines did was they started to stop ships from getting very close to the wharf. And they would put gangplanks with iron on them so that the rats could not cross. And in the evening, or when they're finished unloading passengers and cargo, they would take out the gangplanks until they realized that rats could actually swim. So even if the gangplanks were removed, they could still jump into the water and go into the wharf of Manila. So what happened there was, in the early 1900s, they renovated the port of Manila and had smooth concrete walls so that the rats could not bite and climb their way up. Then the Americans also had to tell people to protect themselves from rats at home. So they had rat catchers like cats. We would usually think they're cats. But in a book, Yesterdays in the Philippines by Joseph Stevens, you will actually see that in some homes in the Philippines, the rat catchers were pythons. And you would see vendors selling pythons on a pole, and you would buy this python, put it in your roof, and forget about it. And this American who wrote about it was so terrified because at night he could hear the python moving up on the roof and couldn't sleep because he was thinking the python would come down and eat him up. But I think the rats were enough of a diet for them. Then the American sanitation officials also realized that maybe we can eradicate rats by paying people to bring them in. So they paid 5 centavos for every rat that was caught. And you didn't have to bring the live or dead rat to the sanitation office. All they needed as proof of death, actually, was the tail. So people would bring a tail, count them out, and you were paid 5 centavos per tail. And according to one medical official, there were a number of very industrious Filipinos who decided to make money by breeding the rats for their tails and sold them to the sanitation officials. Cholera is a disease that we don't hear about. But when you think about it, in the 19th century, there were a lot of cholera cases. One of the most desirable places for a wedding in the Philippines is Paco Park because it has this beautiful circular chapel where people like to get married. It's very photogenic, but most people do not realize that Paco Park was actually the Cementerio General de Dilao. I don't think it is quite appropriate to start a new life in a mortuary chapel. So when you go there, remember that Paco Park is actually a cemetery built shortly before the 1820 cholera epidemic. There have been epidemics of cholera that killed people not just because of the disease but because of fear. There was one time when the natives felt that the foreigners, white people, were poisoning the Pasig River. And so because of their fear, there was a massacre of foreigners. If you go to the National Museum of the Philippines, you will probably see a painting by Simon Flores, 19th century Philippine painter. It's of a very cute baby lying on a bed with some flowers. The owners who donated this to the National Museum acquired it because it was a Simon Flores and it looked like a very cute child, except that when you look at it, you realize that it's not a sleeping child, it's actually a dead child. And this type of portraiture they used to call recuerdos de patay, or memories of the dead, or memento mori. And it's not only in painting, but we also have this in photographs. Early 1900s photographs have people posing with the dead, and it's particularly painful if the dead happens to be a child. Up to around the 1950s, I have been told that some people in the province would actually, before they buried their relative, they would open the coffin, and if possible, they would make the corpse sit up, and people would pose for a photograph. So this was the type of thing that Filipinos did before that we don't do anymore. So during times of plague, when people were not supposed to have wicks or to have dead exposure to the dead bodies, it became a bit of a cultural problem with the Americans. So like they would get an infected person and cremate the person right away. It's just like COVID today. The whole idea of not being able to mourn, not even being able to have a wake or a proper funeral, or some people still do not believe in cremation, but it is a part of the fight against the disease that we have to get rid of an infected corpse right away. So in the American period, during times of cholera, people were so scared of the Red Cross or the medical corps because they would come, they find an infected person, take them into the carriage, bring them to a hospital, and for many people, that was the last time they would see their relatives alive. So it tells us a lot about how people dealt with disease. American medical officials used to complain that when they would get people from their relatives and probably just return a corpse or a notice of death, people would hide the sick in their homes. Or if somebody died, they would not declare the death, they would have a wake, and because they could not bury them, they would just dump them in the Pasig River, which contaminated the water supply. So people were so scared about not just the disease, but also the sanitation officials, which is something that we still face today in our fight against COVID.